This and it's working. Hi, good afternoon, and welcome back. And I'm delighted to welcome our next guest at this conference, Ajit Mohan, Vice President and Managing Director, Meta India. And Ajit, we have decided that while you've been on the wires recently, we are going to discuss questions around technology that relate to what this particular conference is attempting to do, which is focus on how do we use tech for good, how do we build digital public goods, as you heard in the previous presentation. And of course, this year we have, and for all of us in this room, I think it's important to announce that this year we have brought down 20 startups from 5 countries to CyFy, and post this particular conference that ends tomorrow, they will also be touring and seeing other incubators and other hubs in India. So we are trying to create a technology bridge, a startup bridge, where startups from around the world can partake in the Indian experience, and India can, of course, learn from them as well. So Ajit, I'm going to try and focus on some of these big questions, but of course, I'm also going to talk about platform regulation. So let me first start with that big question to you. The pandemic, everyone online, everyone using the digital medium. What were the big lessons for you at Facebook, Meta?
Yeah.
And of course, how are you rejigging, redesigning, repurposing your digital products for a population that is digital hungry?
Yeah. And thank you for having me here, Samir. I, I think Samir inserted a reference to Wire. So all that I have to say is, what we have seen in the last few years in India, especially, Samir, is the power of wireless.
Correct.
For those of you who are
No
not in
pun
on the Wire
intended.
joke, we'll explain it later. Um, I think I think we really have to look back and acknowledge, Samir, that we had started this massive digital transformation even before the pandemic. I think for those of you who are new to India, somewhere in 2016, Geo launched what has turned out to be one of the most explosive experiments in expanding access to affordable internet in the world when it launched in the early days a free version of 4G, which set off a whole series of steps in motion, including how all of the telecom operators responded to it. And in a very short period of time, between 2016 and 2020, we had, from maybe less than 50 million people in India who had access to good quality internet. There was always a bit of broadband, but the big changes really happened on wireless. It moved from 50 to 500 million. And not even China has seen that kind of an explosion in access to the internet in that short a period of time. And one of the things when I look back, Samir, and I feel like even now we may not have understood the full impact of that shift, and it's still playing out. But I think it set the context for what happened during the pandemic. It happened in India, it happened around the world, that people were exposed to a more digital way of living. There was a lot of parts of the pandemic that was not comfortable in India, especially last year. There was a lot of trauma. There was a lot of loss of lives, and there were different versions of the lockdown. But what happened was that people were exposed to digital services in a manner that had not happened before. And it was enabled by the big changes that had happened on access in the years leading up to the pandemic. And what we saw, Samir, and in India was that it has really accelerated a digitization that was in its early phases, going back to 2016, 17. And we are now at a stage where we can conceive that more than 1 billion people in India will have access to affordable, high quality internet. And I think that's dramatic. I think it's pretty clear that will change almost everything. How we access public services, how we get entertained, how payments happen and money moves around. And obviously, when we look at a company like Meta, which has Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, which invariably tends to be in India, the first set of apps that are used by people and businesses, we really see our role as foundational in nature, that in many ways that we play a role in people's lives in terms of allowing them to connect with friends and family, or allowing them to have private communication, or increasingly on Instagram, where we're seeing this massive rise of a creator class. People from smaller towns, people from across the country, feeling like they have a voice that they can put forward that can have followership not just in India but globally. I think the pandemic set the context of all of that change, and I think we're still in the middle of it. And a lot of it, frankly, has also been enabled by, I think, some extraordinary innovation that's happened in the building of public infrastructure like UPI. So I do think we're in a very exciting place as a country where we have not solved access fully, but we have gotten to a scale that is dramatic, and the numbers keep moving up. We have built many public layers, and there are more that are being considered. And then there is this explosion of entrepreneurship, whether it comes from large tech companies like us or from startups in the room that are just rethinking almost every part of how people live, work, and conduct business.
So, Ajit, before I turn to the more political and regulatory aspects of business today, when Facebook in its earlier avatar, and WhatsApp, of course, when it made its debut in India and was lapped up by millions in no time, uh, there was an element of entrepreneurship promotion there. People were doing Facebook businesses. People were using WhatsApp for completing tasks, getting work done. Meta, the new brand. Does it continue to invest in that segment?
100%, Samir. I think, and I'll give you the economic point of view, but so that it's clear that this is a lot of work that we are doing is completely in our self-interest. We don't look at it as an altruistic mission, but the consequences that the work that we do with small businesses tends to have a big impact on the economy at broad. I think to what Samir was alluding to, one of the things that Facebook discovered very early on, that even though the core purpose of the platform was to connect friends and family, you started having businesses establish presence on Facebook, and people would check out those businesses, they would start communicating with them. And over time, we discovered that if we build a platform that was serving smaller businesses first, make it easier for them to identify what customers in the world could have affinity to the products and services that they have to offer, make it easy to advertise on the platform, it was the right answer for us as well. Because in a world that is extremely competitive, where a lot of the traditional marketing model, a traditional advertising model, was built around large clients. One of the ways in which we differentiated ourselves was by really serving the smallest of businesses. You didn't have a minimum amount of money you had to put. Anyone could come in and use the platform. Actually, one of the interesting parts is, even today, Samir, there are 200 million businesses who use our platform. Only about 10 million of them are paid customers of the company. So a large number of businesses still find value in leveraging, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, even though they may not have an advertising relationship with us. I think for those of you who are familiar in India, and I think it's probably true, it is true in most countries around the world, increasingly a lot of businesses think of their primary digital presence as a number on WhatsApp. That is where they're connecting with customers. So a lot of, I think to the point where you talked about, is Meta's mission different? Our mission still remains the same. I think we now have a lot of investments going into trying to build the next computing platform, but the relevance to the small business doesn't change. In fact, some of the most exciting work that we're doing today is how do we structure help structure the conversations between consumers and businesses that have been happening on WhatsApp for quite a while, but how do we make it easier for them? And one of the products that we launched a few weeks ago was the ability to order from within WhatsApp any daily grocery item from a Kirana store through the JioMart network. And this was product work that we did over the last 2 years. And we think that's going to be dramatic for the Kirana store in India, because this is a segment of the economy that hasn't really benefited from digitization that we have seen in the last 6-7 years. All of the e-commerce that we have seen, even as exciting as it's been, a lot of that has happened within the first 100 million consumers, and in a structure that hasn't really co-opted and benefited the Kirana store. And by connecting WhatsApp, which is used by everyone who's online in the country, to a Kirana store, we believe that we are adding value to consumers, but we are helping the Kirana store exploit the benefits of the new economy.
So Ajit, let me move to Meta and more broadly big tech platforms.
Of course.
And their implications on society today. And we've had this conversation, you and me.
Yeah.
Something needs to be done, right? So I think there are two parts to it. One, are platforms cognizant of the harms? And can they use the intermediary definition as a basis of not doing anything? That, this is an open platform, you're connected to each other, it's your battle, it's your fight, it's your life.
Yeah.
You guys go and sort it out. The second part of the question is, governments don't seem to be bystanders anymore.
Yeah.
You recently had I think the White House had called a discussion a few weeks ago, pretty similar to what India has been talking about for a bit, EU, Australia and others. It seems that regulators and policymakers around the world are deeply concerned and perhaps even eagerly engaged in trying to create some boundaries or regulatory frameworks.
Yeah.
So how has life changed at Meta in this new age when you see a greater awareness of harms and a regulatory interest in trying to sort it out? What does it do to your business models?
Yeah, I think a lot of questions there, Samir. So if I can address sort of your first question, are we cognizant of the harm created by bad actors on the platform? Absolutely, yes. And I think we think about it in 2 or 3 ways, right? One, it's very clear, and I think to the conversation that we just had, and that's true in almost every part of the world, that technology does unleash a lot of positive forces. It helps people connect with each other. It helps small businesses become large and global in ways that was unimaginable 20 years ago. And in many ways, if you look at the evolution of technology, going back to the printing press, each big leap in technology has been followed by, explosive cycles of entrepreneurship and innovation that largely has benefited humanity. At the same time, I think it's also clear, and we have seen that in the last few years, that there are actors who want to cause harm. And it's important for platforms like us to recognize that harm can be caused on our platforms, and to constantly think about what can we change on the product front, and what can we change on the kind of policies that we employ to regulate the behavior of actors on our platform that allows the agenda of safety and security to be advanced. And I think therefore there, Samir, I'll connect the dots with, I think, your question about the role of governments, right? I think 2-3 things there. One, and I think we have been now vocal for a while, that we welcome regulation. I think we see, whether in India or around the world, and I'll specifically refer to India, where the government has been very vocal about the centrality of keeping the internet safe, and making sure that platforms like ours hold the accountability for that agenda. And we are fully aligned with the government's agenda on that. And more broadly, if I look at it around the world, I think it's a shared agenda between tech companies and democratic governments on how do we make sure that we work together and have the guidelines in place and the principles in place to ensure that we are able to foster the most out of all the good that can be extracted out of the platforms while limiting the ability of bad actors to do harm. And there's no question that governments in their role through regulation has the most vital role to play in that. I don't think we have seen the intermediary protection, and for those of you who are in the weeds on this, going back to the framework in the US in 1996 that essentially recognized the idea of platforms and just recognizing that there are platforms and there are users on the platform, and if the internet was to grow, platforms had to have some protection in terms of what the users did on the platform, including the nature of speech on the platforms. I don't think we see that as a pass, as a do whatever pass. I think that framework has allowed the growth of the internet over the last 30 years, but we know that we have accountability. We have accountability that comes from local laws, and we have accountability that comes from our role in the world. We have 3.5 billion people who engage on platforms that are owned by Meta. And while we think that comes with a lot of good, it also comes with a lot of responsibility. And one of the ways that we have responded to it, and especially in the last 4 years, when some of the ways in which bad actors used our platforms to cause harm was quite visible, including whether it was misinformation or spreading information that caused real-world harm, was to find mechanisms to create product changes and policies that could address the harms that were showing up. For example, I think one of the things we did was to reduce the ability of misinformation on WhatsApp to go viral in India. And it came out of a lot of ideas that came from stakeholders in India. On the other hand, we have invested billions of dollars, Samir, on the agenda of safety and security. Now, you can turn around and ask, as a company, you have billions of dollars in revenue, so, is that real? If you look at what we have done, both in absolute terms, as well as a percentage of our revenues, I feel comfortable that no tech platform in the world has done as much as we have to advance the agenda of safety and security. Having said that, I don't think this is a static mission. I think people who want to cause harm get smarter all the time, and therefore we need to raise our game all the time, evolve our policies, make sure that we continue to invest. But there is no economic incentive for us not to do the right thing because people want to be in a safe environment.
So, the counter view would be that actually, unsafe speech, unsafe expression, unsafe activities are good business models. There are those who are willing to fund that. That's one view. The second is that in spite of how you may want to be more accountable, we hit something called the algorithmic wall. Every time I want to ask a company, and it's not just Meta, I'm talking about now the big platforms that are more popular, we hit this wall that, that's an algorithm. That's some black box operation that took place. They decided you're off, they decided you're on, they censored your speech, they promoted your speech. Now, is algorithmic accountability elusive aspiration? Or do you think companies at some point will have to disclose at least the logic of their operations? Because right now we face these two problems. Bad actors have big budgets and they are willing to use your platforms, and it's good business. Second, and by the way, because of the multi-jurisdictional nature of these platforms, everything bad in one place is not necessarily bad in another. So people, money used to flow to tax havens. Bad actors use platforms in cozy locations. So one is that challenge. And of course, the algorithms.
I think, again, multiple questions in there, Samir. So let me try and unpack them. I think the idea of bad actors with big budgets is probably not an accurate one. I think what we have seen is that a lot of times harm happens, for example, on misinformation going viral. It's not promoted by ads. I think it is about recognizing whether it's misinformation, recognizing whether that misinformation can cause harm, and about creating mechanisms and policies both to potentially identify misinformation as well as have
So
circuit
virality
breakers.
is independent of the budget.
That's right.
Okay. Fair
That's
enough.
one. I think the second one is, and again, it's very clear that the vast number of people who use our platform, um, they don't want to see the kind of information that usually causes harm, right? So, to the extent that our platforms are open and free, and our model is entirely reliant on advertisers, both from a consumer point of view and from a marketeer point of view, our economic incentives are aligned with the agenda of safety and security because marketeers don't want to see ads against the kind of content that you're calling out either. So I think the economic incentive is usually falsely painted in my mind. I think it's usually, there's a narrative of these are large companies, the
fair
large
enough.
companies
So-
pursue profits, and therefore they must be trying to amplify harmful content or letting harmful content stay. One of the ways in which we have been transparent, and I will get to algorithmic transparency. One of the ways in which we have tried being transparent about how we think about content moderation is by articulating our community guidelines and making it public. So the way we look at, how do we look at content moderation broadly has two lenses. One is making sure that we adhere to the community guidelines that we publish and evolve, and a lot of it is based on local inputs from countries like India. For example, we call out caste as a protected characteristic on the back of inputs from India. But also compliance with local law in democracies, right? So both are important for us, and usually there's obviously a lot of overlap between the two. I agree with you. I think on the agenda of algorithmic transparency, I think if you look at tech companies more broadly, and I think we have also been vocal about this, that there is value in moving towards the agenda of how can we be more transparent, and even more important or equally importantly, Samir, how can we shift more power to explicit choices from users or consumers as well. So one of the things that we are trying out now on the feed, for example, on Facebook is you can kind of say, I want to see more
Of this,
of
yeah.
these or less of these. I think we are kind of trying to work out mechanisms to create more transparency and allow users more control, because both of us would agree that we may be aligned on the agenda of transparency. The hard task is how do you make it come alive? And how do you make sure that you don't make it too complex for users? Users love control, but you also want to make sure that it doesn't happen with friction. I think one of the reasons why a lot of startups do really well and a lot of companies have scaled well, and a lot of tech companies have become big tech companies because they've really thought through how to add value and utility to consumers without introducing a lot of friction in how they access these services. But I do think the agenda of transparency, and in particular, I think the point that you're making is that we should try and stray away from sort of attributing to
Black boxes.
non-explainable things, black boxes about things that are happening, and take more accountability and as well as go on the path of more transparency. I think that's the right one.
So, my final question, and then we'll try to get a couple of more from the audience. My final question to you is that Facebook has typically done exceedingly well when you've had big elections in the world. And, and this is this is not, I mean...
Not
okay.
entirely true, but
Not
I'll
entirely
answer
true.
the question. Yeah.
But the point here is that
Yeah.
in 2024, we have the US elections, the Indian elections,
Yeah.
and perhaps even the EU Parliament, right?
Yeah.
So you have three big elections. This is like the golden year of Meta. Is that right? And how are you going to manage the harms and the brand, the brand through this turbulent period?
Samir, we announced
And implicit in it is that you perhaps may not have done that well in the previous cycles.
we announced our earnings for last quarter last night, and if you look at the news, we do have some challenges to solve on the revenue front. So I don't think it's as rosy as how you're painting it, Samir. But let me address it overtly, because I think you were alluding to it. Political ads as a percentage of our revenues is a very, 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 very small number. I don't offhand recollect it. I think it's less than 1%, but it may be even a lot less than that. Um, Even during big election cycles that you're referring to, whether in the US or in democracies in Western Europe or in India, uh, our, our revenue model is not dependent on uh, political ads
But the
doing well
traffic
during
is,
election
right? But the
cycles.
traffic is, the viewership is, the interest is.
I think if you look at it, Samir, a lot of big changes that we made, including the changes that we made going back to 2017, where we fundamentally prioritized what you see, let's say on the Facebook feed. We haven't really covered a lot of Instagram and WhatsApp, but on the Facebook feed, we prioritized content from friends and family explicitly on the back of a lot of learnings from 2016. So actually, the company's response has invariably been to do things that, at least in the short term, very often we took a hit,
Okay, fair enough.
but because that was the right thing to do. But here's the other thing. I do think when you have a platform with 3.5 billion people, whether those are the public surfaces of Facebook and Instagram or the private surface of WhatsApp, it will reflect what people care about. And whether that is the ICC Cricket World Cup in this month, or it's the US midterm elections in the US now, or India or US elections in 2024, the platforms will reflect what
No,
people will
I
care
think that's
about.
a fair point. I concede that you should not be a platform that changes the temperature of society.
Yeah.
Rather, maybe you should make sure that we don't skew it. That's the only.
Exactly. But it's very clear that I think from our framework, it's about how do we make sure that we do the right thing, that when it comes to elections, we are non-partisan, and yet we are also a place where people do have conversations about candidates and parties and issues that they care about. And I can tell you, revenue is not what we care about. It is to make sure that we are doing the right things about elections in democratic countries.
Great. So I'm going to call a couple of folks who want to pose questions to you. Can I request Imane to walk to the mic, introduce yourself, and pose the question? And maybe even Mansoor, you can also take your position near the mic. Mansoor, are you there? Yeah, there you are. Imane, go ahead.
In light of talking about policies and doing the right thing to help people, Meta has been criticized for the impact of the platforms such as Facebook and Instagram on mental health, and I know that this has been addressed. But as the metaverse is taking center stage in Meta's strategy, how are you thinking about transferring those policies into the metaverse, and so that we can avoid enhancing these issues and creating a disconnect from reality for people, and specifically in light of all the transgressions that could happen in the metaverse?
I think it's a great question, Himani, and it's two things, right? One, I think there are things that we have to do here and now on the agenda of safety and mental health, right? On platforms like Instagram. It's not just about what happens over the next 10 years in the metaverse. And we are, as we speak, thinking about what product changes can we make, including, for example, nudging people to take a break when we feel like they may be going down a spiral of a content that may be harmful to them. So we do take the agenda of mental health quite seriously, and we've already made changes over the last 18 months or so, and we continue to think through what else can we do to further that agenda on a platform like Instagram that you called out. On the second part, Imani, I think it's exactly that um, when the last version of the internet came up, beginning the mid 1990s, I'm not sure whether we could have predicted what happens when billions of people are connected to each other. And all the good that came out of it. We also have a lot more learnings on how platforms can be used for harm. And one of the things that we are trying to do is, given that the metaverse is not something that's going to show up overnight, and a lot of our work is about building the enabling VR devices, the software foundation for this more immersive version of the internet, we are trying to be conscious about what can we learn from the last internet and try and embed some of those principles into the code design from an early stage. And the other thing we are doing is trying to engage with stakeholders like governments to say, hey, we know what happens if the traffic lights are not in place. Therefore, let's do enough work to understand how to put enough traffic lights, enough boundary conditions and rules in place as the next version of this immersive internet comes up. I think we have the opportunity to do it a lot more right than we did it on the last round.
Mansoor, you want to come in?
Yes. Hi, this is Mansour Al Sanoni from Saudi Arabia. We have an entrepreneur company that link all entrepreneurs around the globe and showcase their effort in Expo. My question to you is, what is your strategy on building an infrastructure entrepreneurial in India while there is a lot of changes in technology such as Web 2, Web 3, and etc.? And what's your advice for youth in the future direction?
I think it's a great question. And Mansoor, I think for those of you who are familiar, in the pre-Geo, pre-4G world, there was a point when I think Facebook kind of hit a point of saying more growth for the company will come when there are more people online. And we created programs like internet.org, and some of those programs continue in other parts of the world. In India, the interesting part is when it came to the most underlying infrastructure, which is access to the internet, the hard work and the innovative work was done by the telcos. I think first Jio and then Airtel and Vodafone and the other telcos in terms of what they did to build out this massive, affordable mobile broadband backbone. And now what they're planning to do with 5G. I do think that was the most critical foundational layer. I think given, Mansoor, what has happened in the last 5 years, what we are seeing is that there are enough companies working on innovation as well as putting in a lot of capital to build out different parts of what the next version of the internet could become. There are people doing interesting work around payments. There are people doing interesting work around access to e-commerce, right? In a manner that is agnostic to specific players. I think the role that we have kind of picked is, can we disproportionately invest around the world into the metaverse, right? Into building a more immersive version of the internet. And therefore, a lot of the work that we are doing is really at the frontiers of science and research on, devices, right? On even though you're not in the same room with people, how do you simulate presence? And that's where we are disproportionately investing. I think other companies will take a crack at different parts of it. I don't think this can be built by any one company. I think, however you kind of classify the next version of the internet, the metaverse that we're calling it, Web 3.0, technology-led. I do think there are enough companies with ideas and capital, large and small, who are building different parts of it. And I think it'll have to come together. I don't think it's going to be cracked by any one company, including not us, I think.
So Ajit, let's close with a final question to you. You've also recently been working on the US-India Strategic Partnership as an advisory board member in an effort in DC. Is technology bringing the two countries closer? Or do you now feel there is some friction that needs to be responded to?
Samir, I mean, you're the expert on foreign policy, but I would call out two things. I think if I look at the last 10 years, even in an American company like us, whose apps are deeply embedded in the social fabric of India, and in many ways, India is driving our global agenda and having a huge influence on what Meta as a company is becoming. I think that's playing out in multiple sectors. Mm-hmm. And this fluidity of people and ideas between America and India, I think in the last 10 years, it has been a massive positive force. And equally, the other part of it, I do think, in a world where there are competing forces at play, I do think there's a role for democracies to come together and chart the agenda for what comes next in technology based on common values and principles. And if you look at it in that manner, I think India, US, and Europe probably are three important poles where there is huge self-interest for each of these poles to chart a common agenda because they have a common set of values that are rooted in democracies.
Great. So I think with that, we'll close this conversation. Please join me in applauding Ajit for his beautiful and honest and expansive intervention. And we will place this video on Facebook and Insta. Do like it, do share it.
Thank you, Samir.
Okay.
Great.
So thank you
great
very
chat.
much. And let me
Thanks.
turn it back to Shubh.